Cool. So let's do it. So in this lecture, what I'm going to talk about is the rise of democracy as a kind of global political norm, as it is today. You know, most countries in the world today at least try to pretend, at least pay lip service to democratic norms. The idea that democracy is a good thing is generally a kind of, it's about as close as you can get to a kind of universal political wisdom in a kind of global sense today. I mean, you know, there are very, very few holdouts around the world on that idea. If ever there was a kind of cosmopolitan, truly global kind of shared political sense of something, it would be that democracy is generally a good thing. And it's not so much that I want to question that directly, but I want to think a little bit about where that came from and how exactly that kind of rose to this kind of semi-global kind of consensus. And to kind of wonder if maybe if there's something insidious going on there, if it's not quite as clear-cut a picture as it seems. And in particular, as you can kind of deduce probably from even just the title of this first slide, I'm going to basically make the argument to you, or float the hypothesis to you, that in fact the rise of democracy as we know it, literally the notion of democracy that you have in your heads today, that most people have in their heads, is actually itself a little piece of propaganda that emerged at a very particular point in time to serve relatively particular and traceable interests. Okay, and I'm going to try to tell that story, and I'm going to try to make the case of how that works. Okay, but in particular, I want to tell the story in the context of the larger themes that we've introduced so far, because I think probably in the last week, the vibe I was getting from some of you, I like to think I'm pretty good at kind of reading faces and vibes, and also from what a few people have said to me here and there. I think a few of you were really starting to wonder, like, where does media come into the story that I've been telling so far? We've talked about a lot of different things, right? We've talked about intelligence and rationality and information, and cybernetics and obscure thinkers and ideas and German philosophers. So I can understand your curiosity, or perhaps even slight impatience, and kind of waiting to hear how does all this tie into the media or the politics of the media. So I think today's lecture will be the first one where that will be very obvious now. It's going to, why I've been laying out these concepts up until now will really start to, in this lecture, I think, become clear to you with a lot of fairly concrete implications having to do with the media. Okay, so I'm going to try to tell the story about what I think is going on with the very concept of democracy as possibly a piece of propaganda, and what exactly even propaganda means in a complex modern society. And I'm going to try to tell that story or explain that by kind of leveraging some of the concepts that we've spent some time now introducing. Okay, so to do that, a little refresher. You remember from a previous slide, I kind of I drew for you this really basic diagram of a basic idea out of, I'm pretty sure it's literally the first chapter in the first volume of Marx's infamous Das Kapital. And it's basically this idea that capitalism is predicated on fundamentally kind of this sort of cybernetic structure of positive feedback, where money can be exchanged for a commodity, and then you can sell that commodity for a larger amount of money. That's what the M prime is. And in this way, you can make more money, and money can basically auto-perpetuate itself. Money can grow itself in the circular positive feedback loop. Okay, Marx basically diagnosed that as one of the key kind of defining features of what capitalism even is. Okay, so I've tied that into having certain surprisingly tight kind of how should I say, a kind of topological analogy to intelligence itself, which we also looked at a diagram of, has a similar kind of this sort of cybernetic structure, which seems topologically analogical to the concepts of positive and negative feedback that we talked about last time. Okay, right. So that's all sort of a review. Now, because of these sort of because of positive feedback, and in particular the positive feedback that you see in a capitalist society, not just the one that I just sketched as the kind of the basic circuit of capitalism, the relationship between money and commodities or whatever. That's one example, but not just that kind of positive feedback loop, but other forms of positive feedback characterize modernity as such. So in particular, think about just the relationship between technological progress and economic growth, right? You can think of that as a kind of cybernetic positive feedback process, right? In the sense that every significant technological advancement spurs economic growth, and then greater economic growth spurs more technological advancement. And that, as we know, as we've gone over, I think, and as should be clear by now, I hope, and intuitively understandable by now, I hope. When you have, when the input of a process feeds the output and the output feeds the input, that leads to exponential growth, explosive growth. That looks something like this. Okay, so one of the things I've been kind of trying to explain is that you can only get this type of historical dynamic when there's at least some set of pretty explosive positive feedbacks going on. This is a representation of positive, or an indication of positive feedbacks going on. Okay, and that defines modernity in some sense. All right, so that's all by way of review. Now, here's the tricky thing that we're going to start to kind of try to make some sense out of today. I've alluded to this in previous lectures, but I've only alluded to it. I'm going to try to really kind of make it more concrete and connect it to politics and media in this lecture. One of the key problems with this, and I think when you really start to grasp this, you can start to grasp a lot of particular phenomena in contemporary politics. One of the key problems with this, as a kind of overarching abstract level view of what kind of goes wrong or what gets really screwy in contemporary, with modern life and modern politics today, even as we know it today, is that when you have this sort of explosive economic and technological change, what we might call techonomic change. That's what Nick Land, in that essay I had you read, the teleoplexy essay. He basically argues that with this explosion of modernity, there's no point really even distinguishing between technological change and economic change, because they're so explosively in positive feedback. He likes to use the word techonomic, which I think makes a lot of sense for that reason. So when you have this kind of explosive techonomic change, it affects different people differently, okay? And because of that leads to direct political conflict. So that's one of the reasons that's one of the reasons that I have you read next week the piece on skill bias technological change, because to foreshadow that a little bit, what skill bias technological change means in a nutshell is that for every technological advancement, so consider something like computers as a concrete example. Think about how the introduction of computers into the world is going to affect people differently. If you're really good at computers, you can go off and become Steve Jobs or whatever with computers. If you're not so good at computers, you're not going to do so well. And in fact, you're probably going to be replaced by robots who are going to be just as good at computers as you are. Okay, so that's the basic kind of cartoon version of what skill bias technological change implies. Okay, but so when you're experiencing this sort of rapid economic change in a relatively short period of time for human beings, it leads to profound problems for human beings because we're affected differently. Okay. That's the gist of it. And I want to talk about one of the specific ways in which we are affected differently by technological and economic change. And it's specifically around this concept of intelligence, which we've gone over a little bit before. So again, this is kind of why we've gone over it and why we've built kind of the building blocks up until this point. So we can talk about it a little bit more with more sophistication. And I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, as a prelude to the stuff I want to talk about with democracy and propaganda and capitalism. I want to talk a little bit about human intelligence, because it's important that we have a basic understanding of what it is. And so, as I've alluded to before, but I'll talk a little bit more now, IQ is a measure of human intelligence, okay? And it is unequally distributed. So people have more or less of it. And it is largely genetic, not completely genetic, but it is significantly genetic, okay? So different human beings have different kind of raw intellectual processing power by birth, basically, by genetics. That can be affected by things like education. That's why you commit to educating yourself, because you can boost your own IQ. Absolutely, and that's what you're all doing now, if you're working hard. It's not going to come, automatically just from getting a degree. It comes from what the work you put into it. Anyway, so the reason this is really important, okay, is because, I don't have a particular kind of political angle here at all. But this is a very politically charged issue, okay? And while I don't have a political angle on the left or the right on this point in particular, what I do know for sure is that this represents a key kind of unspoken crux of political division in modern societies, right? So, the left is extremely uncomfortable with the fact that, actual raw objective inequalities in human capacities do exist. By the way, folks, it's scientifically undeniable that on some basic level, there are genetic differences in basic human capacities, including, intelligence. There are lots of political debates about, and there's lots of scientific debates within that kind of larger finding, for sure. And then there's lots of political debates about how to interpret that, for sure. And it's complicated, for sure. But the basic fact that, something like intelligence differs significantly among people, and that it has significant effects on what you're able to do with your life and your life outcomes, that's beyond question. That's basically absolute scientific consensus. Okay, the left basically, as a general kind of worldview, the modern left as we know it, is highly uncomfortable with that fact. And much of kind of left-ish political ideology is very interested for that reason in how the environment can shape you, right? So on one extreme, and this is actually a widely held view even within academia, especially in the humanities, a fair number of people today think that, there's no human nature, that people are a blank slate. That's actually a very wide, a lot of people actually really think that human beings are infinitely malleable and that it's all about environment. And if everyone gets a good home and good parents and money, then everyone can become equally everything. People can be equal in everything, basically. That a lot of people do think that. Okay, so I'm not saying I'm not trying to have a political angle here. What I'm trying to do is map for you that the degree to which this is a kind of unspoken political problem or challenge, right? So the less kind of way of coping with this hard reality and the kind of unfortunate consequences that it produces is to basically stress the ways in which we can, through environmental changes, make people more equal. And I would argue that in some degree, on the more extreme ends of that belief, people on the left push that idea to a degree that is plainly false and misleading. Okay, so that's kind of, I think, the left's problem here, or scientific kind of unjustifiability here. But also, there is a problem on the right wing also. And the problem on the right wing is to sort of overestimate the significance of differences in something like intelligence. So, the right wing ideology is that capitalism is totally fine and fair because everyone just everyone just does what they're able to, everyone contributes what they're able to contribute, and people basically get paid in proportion to the value or quality of what they contribute. And some people are better at things than others, and so those people are going to get paid more because that's fine and fair. And then there's a tendency to kind of downplay the role of environment and the role that social conditioning can play in people's lives. Okay, so that's kind of the right wing error or tendency to ideological inaccuracy or scientific unjustifiability. Okay, both sides, so both sides basically have a way of kind of processing this fact that that inequalities, actual hard objective inequalities between people, lead to fundamentally different consequences and life outcomes, and that's exacerbated by technological change. The left and the right basically have different coping mechanisms, I would say, different styles of dealing with that fact, but neither side is really wants to grapple with it honestly. Okay, that's basically what I think is going on. Okay, and that's not. I hope that's very balanced. That's genuinely not coming down on the left or the right on this side. But okay, so the reason that why am I going over this? One, because I think when you start to see this, you can start to decode a lot of contemporary political debates as kind of weird, mystified displacements of this type of basic problem. Not that it's all about IQ, but the basic fact that actual human inequalities do exist, and it leads to serious social conflict. And we don't really know how to process that. I have my own sense or hypotheses about how the ideal way to process that is, but I'll save that for later. For now, I'm just trying to highlight that problem. Okay, so basically where I'm going with all this is that, in some sense, democracy as we know it is a kind of evolved solution to this basic problem, this really hard, thorny problem in human societies that I've just kind of characterized. It's a way of trying to kind of institutionally deal with this problem, okay? And obviously the basic kind of gist of democracy, you all know it, is, by giving power to the masses to actually control the people, the ruling structures. That means the really super elite and powerful people with a lot of capacity and a lot of inherited resources, whether that be just or unjust, whether that be natural or unnatural, whether it be, kind of a genetic gift or stolen through things like colonialism. It almost certainly is a combination of both. Why, a small elite is successful or super powerful within a particular society. But to deal with that, we have this idea of democracy as a way of controlling that, right? And distributing the wealth, distributing the power. That's kind of the notion of democracy. Okay. Now that is great. It sounds great. But the actual history of how that emerged is not at all what I think most people think it is. So the reason I had you read something like Edward Bernays, for instance, is because you get to see, through reading someone like Bernays, you get to see the actual sort of thought process that is going on, kind of in this sort of early, I wouldn't say early modern, but early 20th century effort to grapple with these like hugely dislocating kinds of technological and economic changes. So what's interesting about Bernays, for instance, is that he's like a lefty, basically, for that time period. He's a liberal. He's what you call a liberal. But when you read him, it's really quite scandalous the way that he's very honest and shameless about saying, educated people have to use the media to basically manipulate the masses. The uneducated, masses who are vulnerable to or likely to engage in all kinds of chaos and destruction. The media should be used to kind of tell them what they need to know to have an ordered life, to have an ordered society. That's like in the 1920s. That's like a humane attitude. That's a lefty attitude for the most part in the 1920s. Okay, so that's interesting. That's one thing that should kind of scramble your sense a little bit of, what exactly is the left, what exactly is the right in some sense. Okay, so that's one thing. That's just as a context, as an aside. That's what I hope you got from the Bernays piece. It should be very kind of disorienting to hear people talk like that very openly and honestly. Of course, today, no politician ever, or even decent person in public that you can find today in modern contemporary media culture would say that we should be that smart people should be using the media to basically brainwash or manipulate the masses into thinking what we smart people think they should think. Okay, and yet that is one of the guiding ideas actually at the beginning of the 20th century. Precisely when things like radio and kind of early forms of mass media are really creating this kind of the first possibility of a kind of national consciousness, right? This is what the left wing is kind of thinking about. Okay, it's not exactly the left wing. That might be a little bit confusing, but my point is that someone like Bernays is not like a right wing reactionary. Okay, he's like left leaning, liberal and humane. Okay, all right, so. A little bit. So since I've introduced that, I want to just give you a little bit of data so you have a sense of what I'm talking about. I don't want to introduce something like IQ and the importance of intelligence differences without giving you some data to kind of chew your brain on. So this is the distribution of IQ. So it's a scale that's designed to be centered at 100. Okay, And, about 70% of people are between 85 and 115, okay? And then, like any normal distribution, like any bell curve, there's a very, very small number of people at both ends, okay? But here's the thing, and here's the reason, one of the reasons why I really want you to have some sense of this, is because if you kind of have the what is becoming, for a lot of people, kind of common sense, let's say, a lot of people really do believe, they just take it for granted that actually, like, intelligence differences are all a matter of environmental differences. They can be changed by things like education and culture. Well, if you actually have a sense of what these differences entail, you actually realize that that's simply not the case. Your model of the world really changes. And the reason I think it's really important is because if you think that human beings are blank slates and they're infinitely pliable by environmental changes, and we can all be absolutely equal if we have the right kind of social conditioning, if you believe that, you're actually setting yourself up for a lot of pain and suffering and confusion in the world. Because I tell you what, I thought this for a long time. I really did basically believe that, because I'm a lefty dude, basically, and I believe that we can have, like, I definitely believe we can all be way more equal. I think there's no doubt about that. But I really didn't realize the extent of actual human differences. And the reason it matters is because if you think that everyone can be equal with the right kind of social conditioning or something like that, you hold yourself sometimes to higher standards than you could ever possibly fulfill. Even when I started this job as an academic, like, I was very ambitious to be, like a super productive, super successful academic. And in the first couple years, like, I just wasn't able to publish that much work. There are academics out there who publish like 10 academic articles a year, okay? And for the first year in academia, I was honestly like suffering and punishing myself and hating myself because I wasn't able to do that. And I really thought if I worked hard, I would be able to do that. And I was really, you can really, really destroy yourself with angst and self-punishment if you have incorrect notions of what human beings are. Okay, so that's why this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but it's actually really practical and I think useful for navigating the world. So basically what I'm getting at is I realized, no, those people who do 10 articles a year, they're geniuses. Like, they're out on the tail end of the high end, and they can write an article, a high level, sophisticated academic article, in a month easily, because their brain is more powerful than mine is. It's fundamentally different thing than my brain is. And when I realized that, I was sort of like, okay, well, that explains why I can't do this. I'm a good scholar and I can do my few number of articles each year, and that's fine. I'm happy with that. I realized that I was not ever going to be able to do that, and that made me significantly healthier and happier, and it made my model of the world more correct. And all of a sudden, I started understanding other things also. Anyway, enough. That's just a personal example to illustrate how if you have incorrect notions about intelligence in human beings, it can lead to really kind of self-flagellating forms of anxiety and even depression and things like that. Okay, the other reason, but while we're here, I should also say that for most of you, this is good news, because the average university student is going to be at least average or slightly above. Maybe a few of you in this room are geniuses, but at the very least, because of the tests that you've had to pass to get to where you're at, those are all IQ tests. Like, everything you've done in school is a form of an IQ test. You know that, right? So this is good news, because most of you are at least above average to some degree, and that means that your chances in life are quite good. You have a high probability of having pretty successful life outcomes relative to people who have IQs on the lower end. And by the way, this is not judging anyone. It's certainly not judging the dignity of anyone or the value of anyone. I absolutely believe that we are you have equal value. All human beings are of equal value, and that's super important. Everyone has a kind of intrinsic dignity that's equal and inviolable. But we have to have some sense, if we want to be honest about society and thinking about how technology affects people differently and understanding the politics of things like information and technology and media, we have to have an honest and accurate sense of where other people are at. And something else you get from understanding this is that, we're actually able to more reasonably and responsibly and humanely kind of understand where other people are coming from, who have intelligences on the other end of the spectrum, on the lower end of the spectrum. It doesn't make them bad people. It doesn't make them useless. It doesn't make them less valuable. It just means they can't do certain things. So, for instance, if you're like below 70, you're basically kind of you would consider someone like that as someone with like basically mentally handicapped in some degree. But between 70 and 85, and keep in mind, folks, look at this graph. There are 15% of the population has an IQ of less than 85. So what does that mean in concrete terms? It means like they really can't do really basic tasks. Like if you give them basic directions to do a really simple task, they'll kind of get lost between the directions and completing the task in a really simple way. So like people with an IQ of less than 85 would not, for instance, be able to, like they would have a hard time working at like McDonald's or something like that, okay? So you have to keep this in mind. There are 15% of the population has that mental and intellectual capacity, okay? I don't say this at all as in any way critical of those people. I say this in a way because as human beings, we have to understand how human beings are different because we have to be able to care for each other. I believe in that, tremendously. And when we have notions of like how all human beings are equal, or can be equal, if only like we get the conditioning right, it actually leads us to really inhumane, nasty ways of thinking and being because we don't take seriously the life and the needs of people on this lower end of the spectrum. Okay, that's all a little primer on IQ and intelligence and in human society and how it affects you all and why I think you need to know about that. So why does this matter for everything else? Well, as you can see, for instance, this I won't spend too much time on this. This basically just kind of gives you some more data to chew on. It affects what you're able to do, as I was kind of getting at. And so this is a rough, can you see that? Yeah, you should be able to read that, right? Basically, on the higher end of IQ, you see things like electrical engineers, college professors, and doctors, right? And on the lower end, you see things like janitors and kind of really rote manual labor, okay? And there's a lot of overlap there. Notice there is a lot of overlap there, and that's significant. So, the smartest janitor can actually be a college professor, according to this, in this sense, right? So that does matter, but the averages are different. Okay, so this is all just to give you a sense of, to kind of build a base for thinking about how technological change is going to affect people in radically different ways, and how that's going to lead to profound social conflicts and problems, okay? So this quote from Nick Land, the piece that I had you read called Teleoplexy, I think really kind of summarizes how we get into the rise of democracy in this kind of technomically accelerating context of modernity. He says accelerationism identifies the basic diagram of modernity as explosive. He's saying that modernity is an inherently kind of positive feedback type of process, or it's a process that involves multiple types of positive feedback, and it's intrinsically explosive. And so it is the firm prediction of accelerationism being the basic kind of philosophy of seeing modern history in this light, is that the typical practical topic of modern civilization will be the controlled explosion, commonly translated as governance or regulation. So the reason I throw this up here is because I think it really nicely and succinctly captures one of the ideas I'm going to try to kind of flesh out for you today with concrete examples and some data and evidence, which is that, for the most part, this is a very high level kind of way to see modern politics. But I think if you start to see the world this way, it actually starts to unlock lots of different questions and confusions about politics today. But the basic idea being that, once this crazy world historical technological change starts to explode, all of politics as we know it is like this always too late, always too slow, really kind of crappy and shoddy effort of limited human beings to try and impose order or control on this like mind-bogglingly disruptive, conflictual set of processes. Okay, so when the point of looking at that accelerating technomic change is to really try to impart to you how much the modern period is like it's a kind of crazy takeoff that is so much bigger than any of us, and it's so much kind of smarter in a sense than any of us. That all of politics after that is like this it's like a dishonest Band-Aid in some sense. It's like the effort of human beings to say, okay, this techonomic change is really disruptive. It's tearing the social fabric apart. It's rewarding some people tremendously, and it's making other people work in factories for their whole life. It's leading to these horribly different consequences for different people. We have to do something about it because this is horrifying. But no one really knows exactly what to do, and no one really has the power to stop this kind of unleashed technological, economic, accelerating dynamic that is so much larger than us. No one really knows how to stop it. No one really has. In other words, we don't have the intelligence or the information processing power to govern or contain the explosion of global capitalism through our measly human contrivances. But we try, and modern politics is basically, when you see it that way, I think a lot of things change. Okay, so what is called governance or government or regulation today is basically our attempt to kind of control this crazy rocket ship that we really don't know how to control. Okay, and so the reason I think this is really useful is because it helps you see that what I was saying before about how the left and the right have these different coping mechanisms for dealing with these serious problems, and neither of them are really honest and neither of them are really accurate. Well, that's because they're both these kind of really crappy, misleading Band-Aids to some really dark and difficult truths and processes that we have to kind of figure out some way to actually deal with more, honestly, I think. Okay. Now we will go into kind of what we're going to do next is we're going to go into the history of, in particular, right around the time of World War I, when radio is becoming very popular and kind of the idea of a national consciousness through mass media is actually being dealt with by politicians and by thinkers. And basically what I'm going to try to show you, is that this is when democracy is being invented as a kind of ideological term, as I would argue, a kind of propagandistic term. Okay. And so I'm gonna try to show you, actually, with evidence and data, how that looks over time, in particular around World War I. Okay, so why don't we take a 10-minute break now, and I will continue that kind of second half of this in 10 minutes. Okay.
I was writing you about propaganda thing later. And the thing is that, actually, I'm not really sure with the thesis, because I think that there is propaganda in the democracy too. As you're saying, obviously, they're using propaganda to go to war, for example. But I just want to say that while in democracy you can argue against this propaganda, you can openly write your article somewhere saying that no, this is propaganda and that you're not going to be killed or something.
Okay, yeah, I remember the email.
Yeah. But while authoritarian states, different things may happen. So I'm not quite sure how to put my thesis right, actually.
Okay.
Because it says that criticizing when my first thesis, criticizing propaganda in a democratic society is over-exaggerating. It's not actually a good thesis, so right.
This is kind of hard for us to talk about right now because I kind of need a break too. But are you around tomorrow?
Yes.
Can you come to my office sometime tomorrow? Make an appointment. You can make an appointment, or just shoot me an email about when you want to come, and I'll be around.
At what time can I come? At about?
I think I'm pretty flexible tomorrow, so shoot me an email with 1 or 2 times you can do.
Thank you.
And we'll talk more at length.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. How you doing?
Just wanted to ask about the essay, because I want to kind of start with it, and I kind of have an idea what I want to write about. So, do you remember when we talked about the idea of technology as a big Z?
Are you going to be around tomorrow by any chance?
Yes.
Because I need these. I kind of need these 10 minutes for myself too.
Yeah.
Because it's like.
Shall I send you an email?
That's fine. Yeah.
All right.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Good. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Yeah, that's good. All right, should we get back to it? Cool. All right. So I hope you're all relaxed and your brains are recharged. So, all right. As the slide suggests, I think it's pretty fair to say that most people think that, if you ask them what propaganda is, or, what comes to mind when they think about propaganda, they think that it is a tendency, that's something that authoritarian governments do, for the most part. I think that's fair to say, right? That's sort of the conventional wisdom. Let me ask you, when I say the word propaganda, what comes to mind? Who are the political leaders, the iconic political leaders that come to mind when I say propaganda?
Fox News.
Fox News, who else? Who? Yeah, good. Nazi Party. What else comes to mind?
North Korea.
What's that?
North Korea.
North Korea, good. That's another one that often comes to mind. Anyone else want to throw one in the ring? China. Anyone else want to throw another in the ring? Cambodia. Much less thought about country, probably. Good. So this sort of proves my point. I kind of knew you were going to say most of those, because those are the ones that come to my mind also when I think about propaganda. And so this is all just a little bit of data suggesting that my sense is correct, that I think when most people think of the word propaganda, they think about, not just authoritarian governments, but actually a few really iconic authoritarian governments, such as, the Nazis or North Korea. So, as I said, I sort of knew you were going to say that. And let's take a little bit of a look at another one that actually none of you mentioned, but I think this is another one that people often think of when they think of propaganda. This is, of course, Stalin of the USSR, famously aggressive propaganda in the USSR. Let's just take a quick look at what most people have in mind when they think about propaganda. Turn this volume up.
Можно мне вас поцеловать, товарищ Сталин? За все! За все, что вы сделали для нашего народа! Для нас!
Right, that's, I think, what most people think of when they think of propaganda. This sort of sycophantic media, audio visuals that are to the greater glory of a particular ruler or leader or whatever it might be. And, I think most people think of it as this sort of, have this kind of cartoon version in their mind of something like this, which obviously to our senses is ridiculous and over the top. But, this is one form of propaganda. Sure, fair enough. Let's look at it, another kind of dramatization of what you could call propaganda. I'll ask you at the end who this is. I'm sure you will be able to identify it.
Deutscher Jugend, nach einem Jahr kann ich euch hier wieder begrüßen. Ihr seid heute hier in diesem Muscheln nur ein Ausschnitt dessen, was außer ihr über ganz Deutschland steht.
Right, so here it's not so much kind of over-the-top sycophantic film about how Stalin is so great, but this is more just sort of, a highly charismatic speaker pushing highly, exciting and enthralling beliefs about, the nature of a people, right? Maybe you're a little less likely to think about that as propaganda, but that's certainly propaganda. When you're able to, Hitler was a famously powerful speaker, super charismatic. Like people, he was able to rev people up like no other, and in large part by this sort of thing. You represent something. You represent something larger than you, all happening across all over Germany. Just charismatic, in some sense, charismatic political speech, combined with highly moving symbolic notions. That's basically a form of propaganda, isn't it? Okay, so that's another thing that people have in mind when they think about propaganda. These are obviously sort of some of the most famous cases. And one more, which I also correctly predicted you would say, a very different, somewhat different style of propaganda. Let's take a look at it. I suspect something was lost in translation there, but again, you kind of like the Stalin video, oh, la la la, our leader is so great, he's basically God, everyone loves him, you get the idea. Okay, so these are all just kind of some fun audiovisual examples of what people have in mind when they think about propaganda. Mostly, it's something that's evil. It's something that only those evil governments do. And also, it's ridiculous brainwashing. And we are so smart, we Western liberal people, we know better. They can't trick us. We're not the dupes that fell for Hitler's speeches. We're not the dupes that were convinced that Stalin was a good guy. We're not the dupes who got suckered by Kim Jong-il. We're smart, educated, cosmopolitan, liberal Westerners, and we don't fall for propaganda. I'm being obviously a bit funny here, but I think it's pretty fair to say that's like what most of you have in your minds when you think about propaganda, myself included, right? So, on the other hand, most people think that in the Western liberal countries, what really is the dominant kind of practice of speech or media is free and open exchange. That's widely kind of associated with what you could call liberalism or capitalism or democratic governments. Okay, I think that's fair to say, right? Not too complicated. A little example of that, real quick, while we're looking at examples. Anyone know who this is, by the way?
Milton Friedman.
Very good. Let's hear what Milton Friedman says about things.
The whole justification for free press, for free speech, for our whole system of adversary justice, the whole justification is that people will be best able to distinguish truth from falsity if they have an opportunity to hear a variety of different opinions. Now, if you only have one opinion spoken, to shift ground, if we go to the Soviet Union, the people in the Soviet Union are enormously skeptical about what they hear from their government. But they cannot know the truth because they don't hear it. They have to conjecture what is the truth because they only hear one side. They don't believe that. Don't misunderstand it. They become experts at reading between the lines. But they still don't have access to the full variety of opinions which would enable them to choose and decide intelligently and reasonably about what's right. So let's by all means have a clash of opinion. Let different beliefs clash in the marketplace of ideas.
Right, so exactly what I was saying, basically, right? This idea that, propaganda is what those authoritarian governments do, and we in the Western liberal democracies, there's a free exchange of ideas and the truth rises to the top. Okay, so that's all just to kind of back up a little bit my claim that this is, I think, the conventional wisdom. These are kind of examples reflecting that this is sort of the dominant attitude towards things. But I think it's wrong, basically. And I'm going to spend the next half of the session trying to explain why. Of course, if you did the readings, as I trust that you did, you should have some sense of why this is perhaps an oversimplified kind of model of the actual history and the actual relationship between media, propaganda, and different types of governments. But I'll make the case more explicitly here. One thing I'll try to make the case for is that modern mass propaganda, as we know it, as we think of it. You hear that? Is that construction work or something? It's kind of troubling, isn't it? It's the ghost of Milton Friedman. All right, I don't know. I guess we'll just roll with it. Try to ignore it. I'll try to speak up. So the first argument I'll make is that modern mass propaganda was invented actually under liberal capitalism. In particular, I'm going to make the case that it was in particular the effort towards World War I that was basically the impetus to the first serious, organized, coordinated attempt by a modern government to fundamentally change the opinion of a populace from a particular state to an alternative other state that was more desired by the government. Obviously, folks, there has been propaganda, throughout all of history. Obviously, probably every government that has existed, going back to the ancient monarchies. Okay, calm down. Use propaganda in some sense. Obviously, okay. I'm not saying it's totally invented for the first time ever in the early 20th century, but I'm saying modern mass propaganda, as we think of it, as a kind of systematic campaign to use all of the levers of a national communication system to actually change the minds of people on a specific topic. That was actually pioneered by, I would say, the United States. I think that's fair to say. That's basically the argument Chomsky makes, and I think that's basically just a historical fact. Stuff like Stalin, in addition to the obvious fact of coming after, it wasn't, it's one thing to try to, just pump out a lot of images saying the leader is really good. It's a different thing to actually try to change the mind or change public opinion on a very specific topic, in particular the topic of World War I. Okay, so that's sort of what I mean by the differences there and how I make that argument. But more specifically, I'll say that the notion of democracy itself is perhaps the most successful piece of propaganda ever deployed. Okay, that's probably the more provocative kind of subpoint of the argument that I really do basically I do basically think this. It's hard to really prove, but I do have some data for it, and I think this is just a compelling way to understand the history. And I think if you do, it unlocks a lot of doors. Okay. And it was deployed to the benefit of corporate and state elites seeking to silence the actual movement of real democracy. Okay, and by real democracy, what I mean there is, the actual flowering, if you will, of grassroots, spontaneous, collective resistance to elite domination. Right. So things like the trade union movement, things like anarchism, things like feminism. All these things were kicking off like crazy right around the time of World War I, okay? And they were really starting to escape the control of elites, okay? In an unorganized, decentralized, kind of radical grassroots sort of way, all right? And so if that's, what real democracy is, like actual people in a spontaneous way coming together to work together and to kind of resist domination, that's what I think of as real democracy, or at least that's what I mean here as real democracy. I'm actually going to argue that democracy with a capital D, as this kind of global norm that we all know of today, as something all governments pretend to be, was kind of launched right around the time of World War I, precisely to kind of suppress the real democracy and instead kind of offer the world this kind of cheap, watered-down version that elites could actually control. And I think that that's basically pretty consistent with, Chomsky's model. I think Chomsky gets a lot of things wrong, but I think that's one thing that his little book I had to read is really useful for describing. And at the end, if we have time, if we don't have time today, that's fine. I'll do it. I can go over it next time. There's actually a lot of interesting new research, like sophisticated empirical social science work coming out in the past few years. It actually has surprisingly convincing data to show that, in fact, even media within, media as we know it in the kind of liberal democracies, quote unquote free media, can actually have propaganda effects. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But I think basically it's consistent with the perspective that I'm putting forward. Okay. So on this first claim, a little bit of some more data or key points here. The first nationwide systematic manipulation of public opinion, as we know it, was by the United States government in World War I. And in particular, just a few data points there. So one thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. public was strongly opposed to entering World War I. For the most part, Americans had no problems with German people. Americans had no reason to want to go to war with a bunch of Europeans. Most Americans had nothing to gain from it. Most Americans felt like they had not much to lose from what they saw as a European war. Okay, so that's just a basic kind of fact that public opinion was generally against entering World War I. People did not want to do it. It was widely seen as a kind of rich man's war. Obviously, especially at that time, I think this has always been true, but especially at that time, it probably is needless to say that who actually gets sent to war is the poor and working people for the most part. The sons of elite, wealthy politicians weren't being sent off to Germany to die in the trenches, or Belgium or France or wherever it might have been. Okay, so most people were like, hell no, I'm not doing that. No need for that. After the election in 1916, and I should also say that Woodrow Wilson actually ran on a platform of staying out of the war. Okay. Once he gets into office, however, after the election, the Wilson administration decides, kind of updates its political calculus and decides that, it's imperative that the United States enters the war. And once, the president decides that that is what is necessary, Wilson goes about with other people trying to figure out how to make people want to go to war. Okay? And it's relatively straightforward. It's not like a complicated conspiracy theory. They actually put together a commission. It was called the Creel Commission. And this is what Chomsky writes about. It's a pretty well-documented thing. It's not some sort of secret cabal. They put together a committee on public information, and the plan was, let's use these new mass media devices, things like radio especially, and making posters and all kinds of things like that. Let's use media to boost public opinion in support of the war. Okay, so they did that. One thing that I want to kind of keep in mind for you though is that World War I, okay, was as you can probably guess, it was obviously one of the most significant of the modern war. It was probably the first, in some sense, the first truly modern war. It was called, at the time of it, it was called the Great War. Before World War II, it was called the Great War. It's only with World War II, obviously, that we then called it World War I. But the reason it was called the Great War is because it was, if you don't know this, I'm sorry if it's obvious, but just in case you don't know this, it was like an apocalypse. It was like the worst war ever in the history of the world, to like a crazy degree, to a degree that was like not almost inexplicable to people. Okay, and the reason I say this is because this is another data point, a real kind of concrete political example of what I was talking about before about how like modernity is this rapid process of change that is really disorienting for us mere mortals who are only so smart. We can only process so much information. We only know what's going on to a limited degree. And there are technological and economic processes that are operating faster than us to a degree that we can't even understand. And so World War I is a really good example of that, because even the rulers who the political leaders who went into World War One, they didn't know they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't know that it was going to be this insane, hellish bloodshed and kind of suicide. I mean, it was like this mass collective suicide machine where troops, millions of troops from multiple countries, were just shooting each other down with new weapons that they didn't even know existed until they kind of were unleashed in World War One. Things like machine guns, chemical gases, chemical weapons they didn't even know existed when they got into it until one of the other foreign countries unleashed it on them. So it was. I'm trying to kind of paint a picture for you of how much World War One was misunderstood. We didn't know what it was going to be when we went into it. Okay, even the elites, even the most educated generals, we didn't know that it was going to be this massive collective kind of like suicide machine that we would be pumping human bodies into. Okay, and that is because technological change was so rapid. In even like the few decades beforehand, certainly the century beforehand, so much had changed since the last major wars in Europe that people didn't know people didn't know it would be so insanely horrific. Okay, they were operating on old models of the world. Okay, and as just one kind of what I think is just a hilarious example of this is some of the generals and soldiers who marched into World War One at the very beginning. Did you know this? Did you know that some of them literally wore the old school garb, from the Napoleonic era, with feathers in the hats and stuff like that. With the brightly colored, really kind of decorative, old school military uniforms that come from an age when people were shooting shitty muskets that took 10 seconds to reload in between shots. The garb that comes from that Napoleonic era. People marched into World War One with that clothing on. So here's an example of what some people marched into World War One looking like. Okay, this is a picture of the representation of the cavalry from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, so this is just to paint a picture for you, hopefully a colorful and vivid picture for you of why I think it's so useful to think about modern politics as this kind of, like Nick Land says, as basically a controlled explosion, as human beings trying to impose order on technomic change that is so much farther beyond them that they can even process, okay? And that's the only way you can explain such a horror show as World War I, where you have millions of people being pumped into this just literal hell, basically, all right? Okay, so that's I think gives you good context for what I'm talking about. But basically, as I was saying, these politicians who were just doing old-fashioned geostrategic calculus, who, because of things like colonialism, imperialism, and their calculations of the threats at hand, you get this kind of military, this significant worldwide military eruption. But the U.S. population just doesn't want to do it. Okay, for the reasons that I already outlined. So I want to give you an example of the kinds of propaganda that the United States and the UK also they were kind of I'm actually not sure how much they were in cahoots in doing that together. That would actually be a really interesting research project. I wonder if the propaganda from the UK and the propaganda from the US was at all if there was any actual human connections, like people were talking together across the UK and the US about how to do that propaganda. But the UK also, just like the US, had systematic propaganda campaigns to boost support for killing the Germans. But as I was saying, for the most part, people, poor and working Americans didn't have anything against the Germans. They didn't really want to kill the Germans. So this is just one example of the kinds of ways in which, the United States and the UK were trying to actively, propagandistically generate that public opinion. Okay, right, so it's not very much less ridiculous than the examples of propaganda that we looked at earlier. Maybe a little bit less ridiculous, but pretty close in ridiculousness. But just obvious kind of, obviously politically motivated attempts attempt to kind of cultivate antagonism against the Germans in a kind of ridiculous, mediatic, audiovisual way. In other words, propaganda, right? So imagine lots of stuff like this, lots of posters. I'll show you a few more examples as we move on. But okay, so the United States actually engages in a systematic campaign to kind of push that, right? Now, what I think some people don't quite understand or know, or I think is a little bit less well known, is that it's actually at this time that the concept of democracy gets really kind of significantly launched into the public sphere. Okay, with, democracy with a capital D, and why is that? Well, it's part of the campaign to foment opposition to Germany and enthusiasm to go to war. To elicit enthusiasm from American people to want to go kill Germans, because the United States is democratic. You see, the United States is a democracy. Germany, on the other hand, is a autocracy or kind of military autocracy, but the United States and the UK are democracies. So that's why you, poor and working people of the United States, should want to go kill Germans, because we have democracy, and you see, this democracy is a really good thing, and it's really valuable. And Germans are not democracy, so they are a threat to our democracy. They are a threat of everything good that we have, and you have to go kill them. Okay, that's obviously, I'm being a bit cartoonish, but I think that was the basic logic of why democracy as a concept really gets off the ground in a kind of semi-global way as a thing that states would now claim to be. Something to keep in mind, folks. Democracy, it seems to us that democracy is obviously a good thing, but it's not. Historically, the word democracy has not always been a good word. It's not always been positively charged. Before this time, for most of human history, did you know that democracy was actually, it was a bad term? You know what it actually meant? It meant like chaos. It meant more like anarchy. It meant more like what you would think of as anarchy. Like when I say the word anarchy, what comes to mind for the normal person? Chaos, trouble, confusion, disorder, violence. Anarchy generally has a kind of negative connotation, denoting chaos and problems. That's what democracy was as a word for most of its history. Because for all of human history, what most people had in mind when they thought of democracy, they meant, that's the uneducated, ignorant masses are going to take all of the money of the wealthy elites. That's what democracy meant for most of its history. It was the fear of that social chaos. Okay? So it was generally seen as a bad thing. It's only at this time, and I would argue motivated by the need of the United States and the UK to mobilize for the war effort, to make people want to join the war, that democracy all of a sudden is converted into a good thing. That in fact we would promote. And that if you're a good state, you would be capital D democratic. Okay? Obviously, nothing in history has very few things in history have super specific dates for, such a significant turning point as this. So I'm not saying that literally, there was like one specific month in some specific year in which democracy took a positive tone, but I'm saying that it's more or less around this time, and I would argue, it seems to me, the historical record seems to me, that World War I was kind of the major kind of impetus for why democracy suddenly starts getting boosted as a good thing, when all of history it was generally a negative term. Okay, right. That bullet point is just what I said. But even more so, states were generally seen as institutions for preventing democracy, for the in some sense. You see this really clearly with the United States and the founding fathers. American republicanism, in some sense, they're in their notes and stuff like that. They're pretty explicit about how the institutions of the American Republic are geared to make sure that the uneducated poor people can't take all of the wealth and power of the educated elite. It's that's kind of the purpose of most political institutions, in some sense, for most of I mean, for most of history, I would say. Now, some people think that with democracy, all of a sudden we became, like, everything changed, and now in a democratic country such as ours today, we all have kind of equal power to change the course of government. I don't really think that. I hate to break it to you. I think that actually, for almost all of history, the purpose of states is to prevent democracy, and it remains to be the case today. But what happens in around 1920, around 1918, the beginning of the war, is that when the U.S. enters anyway. No, I'm sorry, it ends in 1918, starts in 1914. The United States enters a little bit after the beginning, of course, right? At that time, whatever, you get my point. Democracy is really being deployed in a disingenuous way. The idea being, we're going to give people power. That's why we're good, and we distribute the power and this sort of thing. But I just don't think that our governments ever actually did that very effectively or significantly. But the idea started getting boosted significantly. Okay. All right. So a few more examples of some propaganda in World War I. Here you see kind of the social construction of Germany as a military autocracy. They were pretty militaristic and autocratic, so it's not totally false, but you can see how it's being cultivated, right? And perhaps exaggerated, or the distinction is perhaps being exaggerated for political purposes. This is an advertisement for selling the war bonds. Make the world safe for democracy, right? So there you have it. This kind of opposition between the military autocrats and the United States and the UK. The U.S. Marines, first to fight for democracy. Go and enlist. Here you have, I believe that's a British soldier. Look at him. He's keeping the world safe for democracy. Don't you want to help him? You don't want to let this guy who's fighting for democracy go off and die, do you? If you believe in democracy, if you want this beautiful thing called democracy, you better go die with him. So I've actually gathered a little bit of data trying to see if you can tease out this argument I'm making in sort of the deeper fossil record. And what I found is actually quite interesting. What I did was I looked at Google Ngram's data. So Google has this really extraordinary data set that is a sample of all books written in each year, going back, I think it goes back hundreds of years. It only becomes kind of reliable and consistent. So I think sometime in the 1800s or something like that. I forget the exact details of the data. You can look it up. But basically, it's like a sample of something like 4% of all books ever written in multiple languages. And what it allows you to do is search how much certain concepts are used in those books, right? So I should say before we look into. So what I did was I went and I looked at the concept of democracy and kind of when it starts getting mentioned a lot. And its sort of popularity as a word that's used in culture in general, right? That's what's useful about this data. Is in some sense when you have this sort of sample of all books ever written, you can kind of take an empirical look at the culture at large, by how much the culture itself is or is not talking about something. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now I should say before we look into the data that this is very new data. It's very complicated and probably, how should I put it? What's going on underneath the hood of this data is probably contentious and not fully worked out yet, right? So, I'm not familiar. There are probably a few published academic articles that use this data, but it hasn't. This is not fully. This data is not kind of fully approved quite yet through a lot of systematic scientific testing. So it's not clear. I wouldn't put too much faith into it, but it's certainly informative of something. Okay. And if you look at democracy the words democracy and propaganda over time, you find some really interesting patterns. So one thing you notice is that, and this is in English this data shows the frequency of these words being used in a sample of 4% of all books in both American English and British English. Okay, and it shows it over time from 1850 to about sometime in the early 2000s. Okay, so one thing you see immediately is, we'll just go in order, go in kind of temporal order. Like I was just saying, for the most part, from 1850 to about 1900, in American and British English, people didn't talk about democracy or propaganda that much. As I said, democracy was a bad term. It was kind of like anarchy. Like, people don't use the word anarchy that much today, do they? But everyone's running around, all governments run around talking about how democratic they are. So, back then, for a while, no one really talked about democracy or propaganda that much. But look when it gets its first big spike, both of them. And they're correlated. That's what's really interesting, too, is that democracy and propaganda are correlated. So they actually seem to have some sort of positive relationship with each other, maybe. Again, like I said, it's not clear how much we can take from this data. It's not clear if perhaps there are other reasons why, this data looks like it does. So, as I said, be careful with how you interpret it, but, it's certainly suggestive, isn't it? The first big spike in both is right around the time of World War I. That would be right around the kind of 1915 to 1920 area. Okay. So that's fascinating. That's certainly consistent with my argument, right? That, in other words, what I'm saying is that, so here in American English and here in British English, that is basically the word democracy being promoted by American and UK elites for the first time in a serious way, from a historical baseline of really not being talked about very much. Okay, so I mean, if this data is to be trusted, I think that's pretty interesting and pretty hard data in the fossil record, if you will, that democracy as a concept, capital D democracy, is all of a sudden appearing in the culture in a significant, widespread, way in the public consciousness. If books as a whole are representative of the public consciousness, right? This seems to be supportive of of kind of the argument that democracy is, So my argument, of course, the way that I interpret this is that this is evidence that the word democracy is just being deployed, right? It's not like all of a sudden. Is anyone making the argument, or would anyone believe that right around this time, all of a sudden the country's become way more democratic? I don't think that's very plausible. I mean, the basic institutions of government don't change that much at any time that I'm aware of, in a way that would make it that would help you explain this by some sort of actual democratization. I don't think that's why democracy is being talked about more. In other words, a more plausible interpretation is that the word is just being used in a new way, and probably in a rather disingenuous way, for the purpose of the war effort and kind of strategic, international strategic interests, and for the sake of drawing comparisons between the U.S. and the UK or whatever, and Germany. Okay, so that's pretty consistent with my argument, I think. And also, mind you, the same thing happens again in World War II. Okay. And of course, we are all inheritors of this basic idea, right? That, World War II, I think we all see very differently to this day. We're very Westerners, we Westerners in the US and the UK are very, to this day, we're basically proud of World War II. I think the conventional kind of look on it is that it was a noble war, because the US and the UK and the democratic forces stopped the forward march of just inexplicably evil opponents, right? And in some obvious sense, I do think that's true. But when you think about it in this larger perspective, I mean, we all also know, right, that history is written by the victors, right? So it's just it's in no way apologism for the Nazis or something like that to say that the way we understand history is influenced by our own interests, right? Okay. So I think the basic phenomena holds true in World War II also, where democracy is being deployed again as a kind of motivating, propagandistic kind of self-distinction. Now, one thing I'll say about this before we move on is that what's really interesting to me also, the final thing that's really interesting here is that for most of this graph, propaganda and democracy as terms are correlated. And so one thing that means is, for instance, like the book like the Bernays piece that I had you read. As I said, Bernays is a Democrat. Bernays is a kind of for the time period, a kind of a lefty. And yet he's talking explicitly about how we should use media to basically tell the uneducated masses what we want them to, what we think they need to know. Okay, he's basically endorsing the idea of media as propaganda at around the same time, right? So this shows, and this data shows you, I think, that actually a large number of years in the modern period, propaganda and democracy were seen as related, as actually coexisting. That someone like Bernays thought that, and people like Walter Lippmann thought that you needed propaganda to have democracy. Okay, so that is the opposite of what we currently think, right? That's the opposite of what Milton Friedman was saying. That's the opposite of what most of us have in our minds. That democracy and propaganda are opposites in some sense. That's what a lot of people think. It's wrong. It's actually not. It's not supported by the historical data. In fact, the idea of democracy, the concept of democracy, rises with the idea of using propaganda. You see it in people like Bernays. You see it in books like the one I had to read by Bernays, and you see it in things like the Creel Commission, and you see it in things like the deployment of the word democracy for propagandistic uses, basically. Okay. Now you can still think that the United States was in World War I was a better system than Germany. Sure, and you can certainly think that in World War II. That's fine. But that doesn't change the fact that the way words are being deployed and the way that propaganda is actually emerging as a kind of technique of government is actually a kind of liberal invention in some sense. Okay. So, as I said, I'm going to give it some time to chat. I'm sure you have some questions and comments by now. Let's see if we can get one more slide in, maybe. Right, already went over that. This is all stuff I said. Another sub-point that you kind of see in this larger narrative is that I think that this is also when the idea that what's good for the nation is good for business. This is an idea you hear, I think, a lot today. I think also this gets launched around the same time, okay? Because you see it in the propaganda, you see it in the Anglo propaganda. Of course, it's not at all clear that what's good for big business is good for everyone else. It's probably not the case. But the idea that if you want to support your country, you need to do what's good for the big businesses. I think that's a pretty obvious kind of ideological propaganda piece, and that also kind of gets kicked up in World War I. Okay, so this is why, for instance, unions are seen as bad for the nation, and to this day, I think a lot of people see unions as bad for the country because all those unions, all they're ever doing is complaining and holding things up and preventing business and preventing big business from being efficient. In some sense, that really gets launched here also because the unions were against the war, and the working people and there was a lot of like trade union kind of workers organizations that were mobilizing against the war. Okay, they called it the rich man's war and really criticized it. Okay, so this idea that unions are bad for the nation was also a propaganda piece. That's what I said. The way they framed it was that the World War I was a kind of rich man's war, and there was no reason for poor and working Americans to want to go fight that. Okay, that's the dialogue you were getting from them. So you would see propaganda from trade unions also, and from protesters, right? Also, they were involved in the propaganda war, trying to speak against the war, and you see stuff like this, with like a scary kind of tree of death, these skulls, one says debt, the other says disease, the other says despair, the other says ruin, and greed, right? So, this is the message you were getting. This is the propaganda you were getting from the workers and from trade unions and stuff like that, saying why we should not go to war, because it's just rich men and capitalists and elites, who want to send us to die for their profit, which you see at the bottom here, right? Which is hidden, right? That motive is hidden, right? Classic kind of anti-capitalist critique of war. Here's just another example. To arms, capitalists, parsons, politicians, landlords, newspaper editors, and other stay-at-home patriots. Your country needs you in the trenches. You get the irony. They're kind of being sarcastic, saying, if you want to go to war, okay, you capitalists go. Politicians go to war. Landlords go to war. These were, of course, other people. These were people who were not going off to fight and die. So the opposition to the war was making fun of that here. You also see things like anarchists demanding a strike to end the war. And you can see, this is a newspaper clipping, you see how this is being kind of constructed in a propagandistic way. It's kind of subtle, but you see, look how it's reported. They say, great gathering of IWW, that's a famous radical trade union, international workers of the world, and other agitators rail against selective draft. And then in the middle, Germans in the audience. Emma Goldman urges workers to follow Russia's lead. Please take notes, but make no arrests. Obviously, the implication being, that these working people and anarchists and trade unionists, they're basically, working with the Germans to undermine and subvert the United States. That's the implication, obviously, of the. So this is a newspaper clipping, but it's another piece of propaganda, really. Okay. Why don't we just cut it there and chill for the next 10 minutes, and I'll open the floor to you all. I know over the past few sessions, I've given you a lot. I've spoken a lot. I've introduced a lot of concepts. And I want to give you just a little bit of time and space to ask a question or make a comment or make an argument or say something I said was dumb or say something I said was really cool and interesting or just throw in some other piece of data that you think we all might find interesting for just like 10 minutes while I can kind of relax a little bit and turn the floor over to you. Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts, queries, questions, conundrums, anything? Yes?
Just on that, going back to like the graphs you showed.
Yeah.
Obviously in the propaganda. That first little graph there, like sort of early 1900s and just before that, could you more like correlate that with like the increase of suffrage generally in like Britain? You had Parliament Acts going through that allowed more people to vote, things like that. And surely that's more why democracy started shifting up as more people were able to get involved rather than simply propaganda.
It's possible. That's a very good competing hypothesis, for sure. And you'd have to do more work to try and tease that out. It's a really good research project. It could be the case that democracy is increasing in frequency in the culture, in part because there are these other democratic movements that are maybe using the word democracy in this way. My sense is I'm skeptical of that, just because, as I said, democracy for most of its history had a really negative connotation. So this is the kind of research question that you can only answer through doing research work, right? So it's a really good question. You'd have to go through the archives and find, like, the way you would answer that is, are activist groups like feminists and trade unionists and whatever, from like 1900 to 1920 or whatever, are they using the word democracy way more all of a sudden? If they are, you could be right, and my way of interpreting this could be wrong. My sense, though, is that they're not, because it had such a negative connotation, and usually if you're like an activist, you're trying to choose language in a way that gains sympathy. Do you know what I mean? So my sense is that activists were not running around saying, we're Democrats, be democratic, we want democracy, because it was generally seen as a negative word. So that's one reason, but the other reason I would say I'm skeptical and why I might favor my interpretation about what's going on here is that when cultural change bubbles up from below in that sort of way, I think it usually takes more time. So this is like a very sudden change right here that you see, like, this spike right here and this spike right here, those are pretty sudden. And I feel like my sense is that probably only a concerted campaign with like centralized support would be able to create that amount of kind of cultural attention to a concept in such a relatively short time period. But I'm just riffing. I'm just thinking. I don't know if that's true. So it's a good question. I'd be very interested if you looked into it more. What else? Don't be shy. Yeah.
Do you see the growth in propaganda as being a natural effect of technological advancement, or would you say it's more the Wilson campaign really proved a flashpoint in the history of the use of that medium?
That's a really good question. I think the Creel Commission and the case of Wilson in World War I, especially as Chomsky kind of narrates it for you, I think it's a really good concrete example that allows you to see how propaganda can be deployed in a liberal democracy. So it's useful to kind of sink your teeth into that as just a concrete example of how that might look and how that works. But I think the larger intuition in your question is a good one, which is that propaganda is probably a kind of evolved kind of feature of modern governments that kind of emerges in an almost evolutionary way. Whether Wilson did it on purpose or not, it kind of emerges as a necessary feature of modern government, precisely. And this is a perfect segue into one of the larger points I want to make. So it's a great question. This is why I kind of started today's lecture off with all the stuff about modernity and acceleration, because in some sense I do think that what's going on here is that propaganda in the early 20th century, propaganda is not most usefully thought of as discrete items or objects that governments use to try to brainwash people, although it can do that. And one of my points here is to show that liberal governments can do that just as much. But it's the larger point that propaganda probably emerges as this kind of necessary evolutionary kind of feature of modern governments, precisely to deal with the profound confusion and dislocation that was happening from this phenomenal, uncontrollable technomic acceleration that was kind of leading to so much destruction and damage and kind of rupturing of the social fabric and things like inequality and things like the violence of World War I. All these are kinds of extremely hard to understand and process and almost impossible to control dynamics. And propaganda, I think, emerges as a kind of necessary feature of modern societies, simply to process and to deal with what's going on, right? So, Wilson and the Creel Commission almost certainly thought that, the propaganda was they were just doing what they needed to do to make the country do what it needed to do. I'm sure they didn't think there was anything manipulative or bad about it. They were just thinking, we have to go to war, but the people don't want to. If we don't do this, it's going to be really bad. So we need to use this propaganda to govern. So that's the idea of the controlled explosion, of modern politics as a controlled explosion. Propaganda was an effort to control people, even though, society and its dynamics were becoming explosive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a good question. What else? Still have 5 minutes.
Do you think the rise of social alternative media do you think it might accelerate the almost monopolies on propaganda in terms of Facebook and Google control, or do you think it's got a chance of shattering?
It's a really great question, and that would require its own class, of course, and it's a difficult question, and I can only tell you my personal sense or personal hypothesis. It would be a really good research question for you guys to try to figure out. The question, if you didn't hear, is that is social media and kind of the new fragmented media environment doing away with propaganda as we know it, in some sense? And my sense is that it's not doing away with propaganda, or one narrative you hear from people is that with things like the internet, propaganda is not possible anymore. You can't foist lies on people because there's the internet and everyone can fact check and we all have access to all this information. So the idea of manipulating or brainwashing people with propaganda is no longer feasible. I'm very skeptical of that. I really don't think that's the case at all. I think that with social media, what you're really seeing is something like the decentralization of propaganda. So now you can opt into your own favorite propaganda world, but we're almost now we're starting to brainwash each other into increasingly fragmented but equally kind of incorrect notions of how the world works. Does So I think it's become decentralized, but the basic, if propaganda is just, if you think about it as kind of the circulation of falsities that serve interests of someone in some sort of opaque way, then I think social media is the generalization of propaganda and the increasing, almost an increasingly insidious kind of propaganda, precisely because not only now, it used to be the case there was like a relatively centralized source of, ideology or propaganda. Now it's like there are dozens and perhaps hundreds of different unique spheres and worlds of propaganda, depending on what your ideology is and what your, sociological embedding is. Does that make sense? That's just my hypothesis, but I would love to hear other arguments, or I'd love to hear you all try to answer that question. Yeah.
Do you think, like, the corporate media, I'd say it's like a majority like centre-right sort of liberal economics. Do you think it's that way because of the owners of the outlets, or do you think it's because journalism is a very competitive field and that people who tend to succeed in the status quo tend to support it? So do you think it's the journalist like genuine beliefs in like neoliberalism or whatever, or do you think it's the guys who own it who are sort of directing it?
Right. There's very little, we know from research that there's very little sort of direct top-down control from media elites or owners or whatever you want to call them, like telling journalists what to think or write. There are some well-documented cases of that, for sure, but that's the exception to the rule. There's generally very little of that. So that's one answer to your question. For the most part, the overwhelming majority of media is not directly controlled by owners. We know that. But it can also be the case that the natural instincts and the competitive, what is competitively driven among journalists is to the larger interests of the owners and to elites, right? So I think that's almost certainly what's going on. Like what's going on in a modern capitalist media environment is that all of the media actors are doing their best to compete in an environment. They're trying to tell some type of truth in the economic constraints that they're in. Very few people are trying to lie or mislead. Everyone's mostly trying to do the best they can. But that is being distorted in more complex ways than they can understand by the incentive structures that they're obeying. And so that's why I talk so much about this idea of instrumental rationality as this kind of substrate that organizes capitalism. You can think that you're doing one thing and it's totally sensible, and in fact you're like running on train tracks that you don't even understand, promoting and perpetuating interests that perhaps if you reflected on it you would not want to promote. I think that capitalism is basically this mega system that gets us all locked onto these train tracks that we're not trying to promote, but we can't not promote. Does that make sense? I'm afraid that we're running out of time, so if you have questions and you want to chat, feel free to stay. I'm not in any rush, but if you want to take off, go for it. Thank you, everyone.
I think it was Noam Chomsky who said that the kind of the way that media works is not the people on top saying what they need to do. They hire people who share their values. So without even telling them what to do, they get people who they know will do the thing.